This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Welcome to all of you to Canadian Studies gig at Wednesday at the Center. I'm always delighted to introduce guests, and of course I always say that I'm delighted, but today well, that sounds insincere, doesn't it? Today I really am delighted because not only is Bill from my former home and native land, but he's from my former home and native region, and part of my family grew up in southern Saskatchewan, near Whitewood. Yeah, that's it. So although Bill's much younger than I am, I feel a special affinity. W.A. Bill Waiser is professor of history at the University of Saskatchewan in scenic Saskatoon on the South Saskatchewan River. I have many happy memories of time spent in Saskatoon. The Saskatchewan Archives, or one branch of them, are there, and I spent some happy summers there doing research. And actually, the last time I was there, my most recent visit to Saskatoon was in June 2007, when Bill was the Canadian Historical Association's program chair for our meetings in Saskatoon, and Bill did a wonderful job. It was lots of fun. The paradox, of course, was that Saskatoon was originally founded as a temperance colony. British migrants who hoped to come to Canada to get away from the evils of drink. And I don't know if Bill intended the irony, but we had a wonderful wind-up event. Instead of the usual staid banquet that we would have had somewhere in central Canada, we had a pizza party at a microbrewery and watched Canada's national pastime, ice hockey. And it was really quite wonderful. We can't match Saskatchewan, but I hope to introduce you to some of North Carolina's finer. You've already made a start without help. Saskatoon is very beautiful. Fortunately for us, not fortunately for Saskatoonians, it's very, very cold in the wintertime. And I think that's why Marley and Bill have accepted our invitation to sojourn with us here at Duke in February and March. And if you'd like to spend the summer in North Carolina, my wife and I would be very happy to let you have our house free, gratis, and for nothing, June, July, and August, while we're in places where it's not so warm. Bill is a historian of great distinction, a member of the Royal Society of Canada, the author of 10 books. I like to joke that when he finishes his next book, A World We Have Lost, that he's theoretically working on down here, I'll have to take off one shoe because I'll have used up all my fingers when I count his books. Wouldn't you know, and I didn't bring my copy, but my favorite among Bill's books, the 10, it's also the largest in terms of its weight, is a or a flower presser. Saskatchewan, A New History, which was the centennial history of Saskatchewan, published in 2006. And the centennial was actually in 2005, but based on most people who were trying to meet centennials, I thought you did a terrific job of getting out within 1 year. And it's an absolutely wonderful book. It's not at all, it's not in any way official history. It's history that anybody can enjoy, in even cranky pedants like me. One cranky pedant, the one standing here, reviewed the book for the Canadian Historical Review and said, it was a smooth-flowing narrative that can enthrall a popular reader and yet synthesize enough academic scholarship to satisfy a cranky pedant. And I realize now that I was a cranky pedant because there's lots in it that is original scholarship. It's a remarkable piece of work that I commend to you. I also commend Bill's attempt to connect the Academy to the rest of the world. I won't call it the real world because the Academy is the real world too. We're trying very hard to do that here at Duke, and it's exciting to see what Bill's been able to accomplish in terms of finding fora to present the work of the Academy to non-academics, and for that I applaud him. And to that, I invite him to the podium and hand him the microphone?
No.
I hand you the microphone, of course.
Thank you very much, John. John, thank you. And before you go away, John, just a reminder of Saskatchewan, a picture book for you, okay?
My goodness gracious.
And southern Saskatchewan's in there. These are.
I wonder if there's a picture of me.
These are.
We used to go to Round Lake with my.
Color Kodachrome photographs from the 1950s.
Oh, we couldn't afford color.
Okay.
It's all shot in black and white.
So thank you very much for the kind words.
Thank you for the book.
And the kind introduction. Thank you for coming out today. It must have been the palace food, right? Mine is waiting for me, so I won't talk more than about half an hour, if that. Before we get started, Marley and I would like to thank John, Jane, and Amy for their kind welcome to North Carolina. In Saskatchewan, we like to think we invited hospitality, but we've been treated royally, and we're most appreciative. So thank you very much. It's been a real treat for us. And before I talk a bit about Saskatchewan, I thought I would give you a basic lesson in the province, okay? Saskatchewan, who can spell it, please? They can. The unofficial model of Saskatchewan is easy to draw, hard to spell. And you can see that by looking at a map of Saskatchewan. It's the only province with completely artificial boundaries. All other provinces have a boundary that follows a geographical marker, but Saskatchewan is a rectangle. Okay, that's one thing you should remember about Saskatchewan. The other thing you should know about Saskatchewan is this guy. Anybody know? John knows who that is. He's looking for a picture of this guy with a cowboy. That's Tommy Douglas.
He's the Ronald Reagan of Canada.
Father Canadian Medicare. You might know his grandson, Kiefer Sutherland. From 24, that's his grandson. Donald Sutherland, and yes, that's his grandson. And finally, you know her, don't you? Joni Mitchell. That's right, raised in Saskatoon. So that gives you some perspective. Now, everybody thinks that Saskatchewan is flat. I don't know whether you can see that sign there, but it does say at the bottom, tree. I wonder if we could kill the lights even more. I guess we'll just leave it as it is. Okay. Why don't we, is that possible? I'm sorry to interrupt. We'll just turn them right off. I usually, how's that? Can you see that better? Tree? Okay, but Saskatchewan is...
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. That doesn't mean that is the tree. That's pointing the way
to the tree. That's right, to the tree. But you should know that Saskatchewan's not all flat. This is southwestern Saskatchewan, the Badlands. This is Grasslands National Park. And the other thing about Saskatchewan is that it's half forested. 50% is forested. A lot of people don't realize that either. Okay, so you've had your geography lesson. Let's get back to the lecture. This, by the way, is Saskatoon, where the University of Saskatchewan is located. And this is along the riverbank. This is from a thunderstorm about 4 or 5 years ago. And this is the castle, the Delta Best Road. You'll see that later on. The lecture I'm giving today, or talk I'm giving today, is the argument that undergirds this book. So instead of having you read 600 and so many pages, I'm going to tell you the theme of this book in 25 minutes. Okay? And hopefully help you make sense of Saskatchewan. So let's go to Waniskewin. Waniskewin is an ancient Aboriginal site just on the outskirts of Saskatoon. First Nations people traveled there for thousands of years. This particular event took place on September 22nd, 1992. On your left, you have former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Progressive Conservative. In the middle, you have Roland Kroll, Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations Chief. And on your right, Roy Romano, the Premier of Saskatchewan. They chose this site to sign a treaty land entitlement agreement. In other words, they were going to rectify past wrongs. Thank you. Going to rectify past wrongs from treaty agreements through this treaty land entitlement. And what's interesting about that day is that Premier Roy Romano used the occasion to remind the audience that Saskatchewan had to embrace its Aboriginal people or the province's future would be compromised, if not lost. And I quote, "We have great reason to be proud, great reason to celebrate. We're acknowledging our shared destiny." Now that term stands in sharp contrast to another provincial celebration. This one in 1905, when Saskatchewan became a province. So Saskatchewan became a province in 1905, and it had an inauguration party in September the 4th, 1905, in Regina, the capital of Saskatchewan. And as part of that parade that day, one of the highlights of the ceremonies was the Mounted Indians, proudly decorated in traditional dress, riding at the head of the inauguration parade. But their placement that morning had nothing to do with honor, or prestige. Instead, they symbolized a dark, pre-modern past that the new province wanted to put behind it, if not forget. And I quote from the Moose Jaw Times in 1905. There they were, the remnants of a departing race, peoples of an inferior civilization. Now, this conviction that First Nations were not to be part of Saskatchewan's future characterized the public's attitude for the first half of the 20th century. In fact, if the province was to fulfill its great destiny, then Indians like those in this inauguration parade were expected to ride off into oblivion and never be heard from again. Now, this very different attitude towards Aboriginal peoples, Romanel's remarks in 1992 versus those remarks in 1905, was only one of the many differences between Saskatchewan at the beginning and the end of the 20th century. In fact, the province was a much different place a century ago. In 1905, our first and only territorial premier argued that Western Canada should be turned into one large province to be called Buffalo. These are bison, not buffalo, these are bison from Grasslands National Park in southwestern Saskatchewan. But Haltane wanted this one large western province to be called Buffalo. So if he got his wish, I'd be known as a Buffalonian, not a Saskatchewanian. Got that? Haltane never got his wish. Instead, we got that rectangular province in 1905. He created, the government, federal government, created two new western provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Here's a test for you. Anybody got the answer? Okay, Haltane never got his wish of one large western province, but the new province of Saskatchewan was no less confident about its future. Indeed, if galloping population growth and wheat production in the early 20th century were any indication, then Saskatchewan was on its way to greatness. And this is a line that they used in 1905. The future would just have to catch up. Isn't that a remarkable statement? The future would have to catch up. And that was demonstrated by a couple of cartoons from the period. Here's Prime Minister Laurier in 1905, and here are the new provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. He's a nursemaid. Or there's this other one from the newspapers where the Western twins get their long trousers and they've become provinces. So what was this future in 1905? Saskatchewan has become Canada's most powerful and populous province. People in Canada would not believe that statement, but we'll let it pass today. The political leadership of the day not only believed that the future belonged to the province, but more importantly, that the province could decide and shape that future. The Saskatchewan government consequently embarked on an ambitious province-building program determined to put the old territorial days and any lingering sense of colonialism behind it, while cultivating a new and separate identity as Canada's powerhouse prairie province. That's almost as hard to say as Rivalry Week, right? Saskatchewan was to be based on one dominant culture, Anglo-Canadian, engaged in one dominant economic activity, the production of wheat for the export market, and one dominant zone of activity, the southern half of the province. By such means, Saskatchewan was confident that it would fulfill its great destiny. In fact, any deviation from this one culture and this one economic activity was regarded as a threat to the province's future. Saskatchewan had hitched its wagon to these key ideals, was not about to be diverted from its chosen path. Perhaps the best place to start with this original vision is with numbers. So many immigrants were pouring into Western Canada in the early 20th century that our Prime Minister Laurier stepped outside the normal census cycle and ordered a special Western census in 1906. In the United States, as you know, you have your census on 1900, 1910, 1920, and Canada is 1901, 1911. Well, in 1906, they had a special Western census because Western Canada was growing so quickly. Laurier wanted a statistical snapshot of this phenomenal growth, including men like this, sorry men like this, living in Saskatoon in 1906. What did the 1906 census find? Well, they told a remarkable tale of unprecedented growth. In Saskatchewan alone, the 1891 population grew 127% by 1901. And between 1901 and 1906, the population grew 182%. These immigrants effectively swamped the First Nations population. This is a picture from southwestern Saskatchewan in the late 19th century. This is a picture from central Saskatchewan in the early 20th century. This is the Métis population. The first one was First Nations. It would be a mistake, however, to see settlement of Saskatchewan during these years as a deliberate attempt to create a multicultural province. Saskatchewan did seek settlers from continental Europe, but the Saskatchewan government expected immigrants to accept and embrace the ways and traditions of their new country, to be Canadianized according to the terminology of the time. And the only way to bring about this transformation was to get immigrants established on the land and interacting with Anglo-Canadian institutions. Settlement and assimilation went hand in hand. This concern about the cultural makeup of the province dominated Saskatchewan political life during the first third of the 20th century. This is a Doukhobor settlement. The Doukhobors were refugees, pacifist refugees from Russia. They settled in dozens of villages in west central Saskatchewan in the early 20th century. By the 1920s, though, many residents of British origin had come to regard settlements like this and the persistence of ethnic identities as a blight on the province's future and actively pushed for cultural uniformity. In fact, it was argued in the 1910s and 1920s that we should give up on the parents and concentrate on the children. Some had even begun to question whether the integration of continental European immigrants into the larger society was desirable, let alone possible. And this was demonstrated by this cartoon. And as you can see in this cartoon, these continental European immigrants are going underneath the immigration wall, and around his neck, his kerchief says disease, pauper immigration. That's the attitude towards these people. So Saskatchewan may have had the most ethnically diverse population in Canada in the early 20th century, but it didn't like it. In fact, Saskatchewan stubbornly resisted becoming a multicultural society. The idea of Saskatchewan embracing multiculturalism is a myth in the early 20th century. Saskatchewan also pinned its destiny on one dominating economic activity, namely wheat farming, in one dominant region, the southern half of the province. In fact, the government's gaze rarely extended to the northern half of the province. And in fact, the geographic center of Saskatchewan is 100 miles north of Prince Albert. And to put this in perspective, Prince Albert is about an hour and a half's drive north of Saskatoon, where I'm from. So it's about 2.5 hours drive north of Saskatoon. That's the geographic center. The government ignored the provincial north. One provincial cabinet minister even called northern Saskatchewan, and I quote, another country altogether. Saskatchewan concentrated its energies on growing wheat for the Canadian export market. It believed that this activity and this activity alone would be the means to greatness for the province and help realize its ambitions within Confederation. And well, here again, the statistics behind this activity are truly remarkable. This is the oldest extant elevator in Saskatchewan. It dates from 1895. As the vast network of branch lines and grain elevators spread over the southern Saskatchewan landscape in the early 20th century, the wheat economy took root and flourished. By World War I, Saskatchewan was producing half the wheat grown in Canada. It's produced in one province in Saskatchewan. Farmers grew wheat for the simple reason that Saskatchewan's settlement and development had been organized around its production. The homesteads, the railway branch lines, the country elevators, even the harvest excursions were all part of a grand design to supply wheat to the international export market. The wheat economy would not have been established so quickly and efficiently if not for the active encouragement of the federal provincial governments and the investment in the region by large, powerful corporations, railway companies, elevator companies, etc. The large rural population, together with the steadily growing importance of agriculture, made farmers the dominant force in Saskatchewan political life. I'll take one break here, and I wanted to show you this picture from a farm. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's a pipe-smoking dog. In fact, if you've been very observant through these images, you'll notice that the dog has been the one persistent figure in most of these pictures. This dependence on a single crop also influenced urban growth in the southern half of the province. The tens of thousands of prospective farmers who poured into the West after 1900 required the services of villages, towns, and cities if they were going to transform their homesteads into viable commercial operations. It was this new rural demand, precipitated by the record number of settlers, that fueled a town-building frenzy, the likes of which had never been seen over the past century in Saskatchewan. Here's Saskatoon from the late 1930s. This is taken from the railway station, which is no longer there in downtown Saskatoon, towards the Bessborough, which sits on the river. The river is just behind it. To give you an example of this phenomenal growth, Saskatoon in 1901 had a population of 113. By 1911, the taking of another census, Saskatoon had a population of 12,000. It went from 113 to 12,000 in 10 years. Even then, the civic fathers of Saskatoon questioned the census figures and conducted their own census. They believed the city was much larger. And so they counted people staying in hotels, people passing through on trains, and of course, pregnant women as too. What is often misunderstood, though, about this urban growth was that it was entirely dependent on the wheat economy. And Saskatchewan was first and foremost a rural province where 3 out of every 4 residents lived in the country. In fact, 4 out of every 5 people worked in agriculture in early 20th century Saskatchewan. These then were the defining features of the province a century ago. One dominant culture, one dominant crop, and one dominant region. Together, they would pave the way for Saskatchewan's future as Canada's powerhouse province. It was an extremely narrow vision, but one that was readily embraced by the political leaders of the day. Here's a cartoon from the 1920s. This is Prime Minister King, and he's awarding the West more seats in the federal House of Commons. And if you notice who is the biggest lad amongst the 4 western provinces, it is Saskatchewan. What about these ties between Ottawa and Saskatchewan? It'd be like the ties between Washington and North Carolina. Well, Prime Minister Laurier in 1910 made a special Western visit and visited Western Canada because it was believed it was so important politically. In fact, in 1910, he laid the cornerstone for the first major building at the university where I'm from. They also reached to the House of Commons. It would be like the equivalent of somebody going to your Senate and taking 2 senators and turning them into governors, state governors. They did that in Saskatchewan. They took 2 members of the House of Commons and they turned them into provincial premiers. They also took members of the provincial cabinet and sent them to Ottawa as cabinet ministers. So it would be like taking members of your state legislature and sending them to Ottawa, sending them to Washington, and making them part of Obama's cabinet. So there were these close links. The other link I can give you is Prime Minister King, and he's the guy in the $50 bill. I brought along a Canadian 50 to show you. I'd pass it around, but I don't know you that well. He's the guy in the 50. He also had a seat in Saskatchewan. So there are these close ties. These arrangements ensured that the interests of the province were not ignored nor neglected, and Saskatchewan enjoyed some real political clout. It's not too exaggerated to suggest that the province in the 1920s not only expected to dominate the region, but within time be the banner province of Canada. Saskatchewan was the region, and the region would lead the nation. That was the thinking in the 1920s. Saskatchewan's chosen path was create problems during the Great Depression in Saskatchewan in the 1930s. And in fact, Saskatchewan was hit by a double whammy in the 1930s. Record low commodity prices. It sent shock waves through the Canadian and in particular the Saskatchewan economy. Record low commodity prices, in particular the price of wheat. And we had a series of ecological disasters as demonstrated by this cartoon. One of the worst was several hundreds of thousands of acres literally out of control in southern Saskatchewan. The past insistence on one dominant culture and one dominant economic activity in one dominant region would compound the difficulties of the 1930s. Because we were so reliant on growing wheat, it really hurt Saskatchewan. In fact, Saskatchewan was the hardest hit province in the 1930s, and it's because of that original blueprint. So we face a very uncertain future after the Second World War. And it's to this I want to turn to now. In the early 21st century, in 2005, Saskatchewan faces a much different, more difficult future. Unlike a century earlier, though, it is the province that will have to catch up. The future will not wait. As one Regina civic official philosophically commented, in direct contrast to earlier comments at the beginning of the 20th century, there is no clear roadmap to the future. The path will not be found, it must be created. So what is Saskatchewan in 1905? Well, it's demonstrated by this billboard. Bigger than a bread basket. And the national consciousnesses, people outside Saskatchewan, people in Canada today, believe that I come from a land that's frozen in time. We never change our clocks, by the way, in Saskatchewan, so we are kind of frozen in time. They believe we're a land of wheat fields, grid roads, country elevators, where nothing important ever happens, and anybody with talent or ambition leaves to make their mark elsewhere. Where did I go wrong, John, right? In fact, journalist Peter Zowski, some of you might have heard of him. He was on the equivalent of public radio in Canada. He was on CBC. He got his start in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. That's also where Art Linklater was born. But Peter Zowski liked to call Saskatchewan the most Canadian of provinces. It's like an old comfortable pair of slippers. That's Saskatchewan. That's the national image and the national consciousness. What's the reality? Well, the reality in 2005 is an increasingly urbanized society. 2/3 of Saskatchewan's population today lives in urban areas. We're an urban province, and nobody in Canada believes that. We're an urban province. 2/3 of our population lives in urban areas. We've got a diverse economic base. We've got a rich cultural life. And we are trying to come to terms in 2005 with our agricultural past and our Aboriginal population. Indeed, at the start of this new century, the province is grappling with the twin challenges of meeting the needs of its Aboriginal community and maintaining a decaying rural Saskatchewan. And in fact, we're in this peculiar situation because we have both a growing, young, urban Aboriginal population and a declining, aging, non-Aboriginal population. So that's the problem or the challenge we face in Saskatchewan today. One of the big challenges for the people, for the province, will be retaining people. At one time, Saskatchewan was the third most populous province of Canada after Ontario and Quebec. People in Canada find this hard to believe. Those days are long past. Our population today in Saskatchewan is around 1 million. It's hovering around the 1 million market. It deviates a little high, a little lower, but it stays around 1 million. Regina and Saskatoon will continue to grow at the expense of rural areas. Remember I said 2/3 of Saskatchewan people live in urban centers? Well, 2 out of every 3 urban residents in Saskatchewan live in one of 2 cities, either Saskatoon, where the provincial university is, or Regina, which is the provincial capital. And Regina and Saskatoon are capturing people that are leaving the rural countryside. Distance, in the meantime, has once become a factor in rural lives, as the low population density and low demand mean that many services are no longer available in the countryside, and people have to go to larger centers. Despite the relentless population growth over the decline over the past few decades, Saskatchewan remains the most rural of the 3 prairie provinces, the other 2 being Alberta and Manitoba. We still have the largest rural population, but as I said, we are still an urban province. Rural Saskatchewan remains an integral part of the provincial identity. Any provincial leader in Saskatchewan would be committing suicide by turning their back on rural Saskatchewan, even though it's in decline, even though it's in decay. And I would suggest that to you because rural society is no less complex, no less vibrant than its urban counterpart. In fact, rural Saskatchewan is neither static nor one-dimensional. What has changed over the past century, however, is that rural residents probably have more in common today with their urban counterparts than at any other time in the province's history because of the new technology, because of internet, because of the email, and because of mass consumer culture. In other words, online shopping. That's done the trick. The precipitous decline of rural Saskatchewan is a reflection of the changed provincial economy. Over the past century, geography and climate were two constant concerns as farmers grew and marketed crops to feed the world's population. The problem today is that agriculture now makes only a marginal contribution to the provincial economy. What's your guess? Humor me. What percentage of the provincial GDP do you think comes from agriculture? 9. Remember the original blueprint? One dominant activity, growing wheat for the international market. It makes 9% of our provincial economy. The decline in the relative importance of agriculture does not mean the provincial economy is any less vulnerable. Even though Saskatchewan's range of trade resources is very diverse, and I'm talking about potash, oil, forestry products, and trade is carried on with several countries, and in fact Saskatchewan has the distinction of carrying on trade with more countries than any other province in Canada. It's quite a distinction. We still have no control over these commodity prices, and our economy is still vulnerable. So we have a more diverse economy, but because of its reliance on resources, we're still vulnerable. Do you know what that is, ladies and gentlemen? It's not potash. It's uranium. We have the largest uranium deposits in the world. And in fact, in the 1960s, we were called the Saudi Arabia of uranium. We have 2 mines where the uranium is so rich, it should not be mined. They're going ahead, though. MacArthur Lake and Cigar Lake. They're still going ahead. It's so rich. So this is a uranium mine, and they dot northern Saskatchewan. Some argue that the best hope for the province's economic future continues to be greater diversification through provincial incentives. In other words, spend provincial money to develop the economy. But no amount of forced growth can overcome the natural disadvantages of Saskatchewan's location. We're in the middle of Canada. On one side you have the mountains, on the other side you have the Canadian Shield. Any new economic development, moreover, must involve northern Saskatchewan residents. In fact, the problem with a lot of this northern development is that it's only recently that northern Aboriginal peoples have come to play a part in that. And in fact, for a century, Regina treated northern Saskatchewan little more than a colony. And this is exactly what our first and only territorial premier in 1905 complained about Ottawa. Ottawa treated Saskatchewan like a colony. That's why we wanted to become a province in 1905. In 2005, northern Saskatchewan is much like a colony. And in fact, a lot of people in Saskatoon today, if you were given a map of northern Saskatchewan, they could not put many places on the map because it still remains another country altogether. The integration of the provincial north will mean jobs. And in fact, new jobs must be created throughout Saskatchewan to replace those being lost in agriculture. This is an Aboriginal family in the 1970s. The quest for new jobs means addressing the fact that Saskatchewan has the least educated population in Canada. Education and training will be needed if the provincial workforce is to participate in the new knowledge-based economy. This is a farm from the 1950s as well. This is the First Nations University of Canada. It's the first accredited Indian-run institution of its kind in Canada. And First Nations University of Canada located in Regina. And the design in the back, if you can see that, is by the Métis architect Douglas Cardinal, who also designed the National Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. By far, though, the most critical challenge for Saskatchewan in the new century will be the role and place of the growing Aboriginal population, something that many citizens would rather not think about, let alone deal with. As of 2001, Aboriginal people, Indians and Métis, make up almost 1 in 8 of Saskatchewan residents, or about 13.5%. By 2045, just 3.5 decades away, they are projected to account for 1 in 3 people in Saskatchewan by 2045. 2045. 1 in 3 people in Saskatchewan will be Aboriginal. Average size of the family, family sizes are large, and in fact, if you look at the demographic statistics, the larger Aboriginal population are youth. In fact, the largest component of the category between 0 and 21 years of age is Aboriginal in the province. So Saskatchewan cannot afford to discount its Aboriginal population, particularly given its lowly place in provincial society, or there will be bigger, more serious problems in the future. Now, responding to these changes underway in the province offers a new opportunity for Saskatchewan to lead Canada once more. These words might seem overly ambitious, if not unrealistic, given the complex challenges facing the province in the new century. But Saskatchewan has never been one to think small, never one for believing that things were out of reach and settling for second place. And it is only by examining the province and its real and imagined place within the region and the larger nation can you understand and appreciate its history over the past 100 years. John will probably be the only one who can appreciate this, but in the 1990s we sent the first person of Ukrainian descent to Ottawa as the Governor General, Ray Natishin. He was from Saskatoon, and he was a Saskatchewan Rough Rider fan, okay? That's why the flag at the top. Despite all the talk in Canada about a kind of pan-Western Canadian identity, Saskatchewan sees itself as unique, and it is unique. Perhaps one of the best examples is the 2003 provincial election, which marked the first time in Saskatchewan history that neither of Canada's 2 original parties, you might have heard of them, the Liberals and Conservatives, held a seat in the Saskatchewan legislature. Instead, in the Saskatchewan legislature, we have the New Democratic Party, which began in Saskatchewan, and we have the Saskatchewan Party, which is also a homegrown party. So as I said, politics in the province are now dominated by 2 distinctly homegrown parties. The Saskatchewan electorate, meanwhile, has come to identify the province with the principles and programs put in place over the last quarter century that calls for a kind of mixed economy. Yes, we have crown corporations, but we also have private investment as well, so we have a mixed economy. Dealing with the new provincial landscape will be difficult, sometimes frustrating for Saskatchewan's 2 homegrown political parties in this new century. The road to the future for Saskatchewan will be bumpy. Solutions will be found. It is just that there will be no easy answers. The solutions I would suggest to you will be, though, Saskatchewan ones. We can't expect Ottawa to find the answers for us. The people of the province can be expected to look to themselves and their innovative spirit as they've repeatedly done in the past, particularly since the Great Depression. Saskatchewan has a dealing creatively with challenges, disadvantages, and obstacles. Medicare is one example. This is what has made the province special, and I'm speaking as someone for Saskatchewan. And in fact, all you have to do is go back and look at Premier Roy Romano's comments on how we could talk about a shared destiny in 1992. So I think the people in Canada should be watching Saskatchewan closely and see what happens over the next few decades. Thank you. That's from the inauguration parade in 1905, one of the ceremonial arches. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in a lot of things. First of all, thank you. But the uranium
Yes.
in those lakes, that shouldn't be...
Not in lakes.
Oh.
They're nearby lakes, but
Nearby.
they need the lakes are used for tailing ponds, and they need the water for the processing.
So, why aren't people up in arms and
They're not up in
rebelling?
arms because people rarely travel in northern Saskatchewan. People that do go to northern Saskatchewan, like Johnny Cash, who love to go to northern Saskatchewan, go to hunt and fish. But it's out of sight, out of mind. It makes up an important part of the economy, mining does today in Saskatchewan, and there isn't that significant concern about it. The only time that the population south of the geographic center of the province gets concerned about uranium mining is when there's an Aboriginal blockade or if there's an accidental spill or something and it makes headlines. But neither governing party has made any attempt to deal with uranium mining or to have a serious debate about it. But at the same time, the flip side of that is that many years ago they were thinking of putting a uranium processing facility just north of Saskatoon in a Mennonite community. And there was a significant backlash against it. It was stopped. But this uranium is simply, the raw product is shipped out for processing, the yellow cake.
So environmentalists, nobody?
There is some, but nothing significant. The thing we're facing now connected to this is you've heard of the Athabasca oil sands or the tar sands, Canada's so-called dirty oil secret. No. You've heard about the tar sands in northern Alberta. Many of you might have heard about the tar sands and how Alberta's getting a black eye over that. We have tar sands in northwestern Saskatchewan, and there's talk of developing them. But what's ironic now is that because of the development of the Athabasca tar sands, we're having acid rain in northwestern Saskatchewan. It's affecting the vegetation. So even though we're seeing the side effects of the industrial development next door in the neighboring province, they're still thinking of going ahead with oil sands development in northwestern Saskatchewan.
Could you please also tell us a little bit about the political landscape and the Indigenous participation, the First Nations participation? Because it's interesting how you put it. It's almost as a threat to the history of the province, right? As we came here, we were white, Western society, one product, modern, right? There's one way to go forward, and now suddenly the threat comes or something. It's interesting.
It's a complicated question, but first of all, today there's little Aboriginal representation in the provincial legislature. There are 2 or 3 people of Aboriginal descent in the provincial legislature, and there have been 2 or 3 people in the provincial cabinet. One of the difficulties of answering that question with any accuracy is that people have to self-identify. And for example, I know of a cabinet minister that served in the NDP government that was of Métis descent, but he didn't self-identify, so he was not counted as part of the Aboriginal component in the legislature. So, but that problem or challenge also extends to women. There are a few women in the Saskatchewan legislature, and yet we were one of the first provinces in Canada that gave women the right to vote almost a century ago, but they're still women. So there's still that challenge. But what you'll find today is that the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, and that's what they call themselves. So if I've used the word Indian today, that's the term that they continue to use in Saskatchewan, okay? Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. They themselves believe that they can secure more and have the kinds of debates and discussions through their organization. And so they are meeting with cabinet ministers or with the premier almost on a one-on-one basis, and they're reaching agreements that way. One example is over gaming or gambling. And there is Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Association where they share the revenues. They are now engaged in discussions over resource development. So I think and I can't speak for Aboriginal people, but my reading of it, looking at it, is that they've chosen to do it through their own organization. They can feel they can be more successful that way.
Does Saskatchewan have a development strategy that beyond raw materials, for example, the development of services or development of industry?
Yes, they have a significant, what I'm trying to think of, in Saskatoon, the research, why can't I think of that term?
Biomedical?
Not biomedical, but
like
innovation plays, but the Plant Institute. Plant biotech, they're doing that. Yes, there is limited service industry for Western Canada. There's synchrotron. We have the largest synchrotron in Canada based in Saskatoon, so there's research there and spin-offs that way. But what really drives our economy are the resources. That being said, you know, we are vulnerable, but we've all gone through a North American recession. It's been a depression in some places, okay? Saskatchewan was the least hard hit because of the variety of resources. Even next door in Alberta, which was so dependent on oil and natural gas, it was heavily hurt. It's carrying significant debt today, and in fact, that situation is in part Chase, the provincial premier from office. He's not going to run in the next election. We weathered that storm because we had such a variety of resources that we extract and process. So we weren't as hard hit. But there is a concerted effort, if not to bring about manufacturing of these resources, capture a larger share through royalties and other schemes that way. That's the strategy they're using. And that goes back to the Tommy Douglas government in the 40s and 50s, and particularly the 1960s and 70s. They were locked initially into long-term, low-resource or renting strategies, and they changed it in the 1970s. And there's talk of increasing their royalties today. That was actually in the news yesterday over potash. Potash, if you're wondering what the heck it is, it's a fertilizer. We have the most potash in the world in Saskatchewan.
What is the current ethnic breakdown of the non-Aboriginal population? I mean, have you had the multicultural
yes, and in fact, the Anglo-Canadians make about maybe 25% to a third of today. We are a pluralistic society. We've embraced people from continental Europe, in part because what happened in the 40s and 50s, we didn't get the new post-war immigration. So people that came in the early 20th century and been here for 2 or 3 generations, people with last names like Gizerowski, et cetera, they're Saskatchewan names today. They're part of that makeup. And in fact, Saskatchewan has the distinction of having the largest population that's been born in the province. And so that also enhances the provincial consciousness. In terms of embracing, moving beyond that Anglo-Canadian one dominant culture, we gave Canada its first Governor General of Ukrainian descent. We had our first premier in Saskatchewan of Catholic faith, not until 1982. We represented the Conservative Party, but Saskatchewan had a strong strain of anti-Catholicism in the early 20th century. But we've had a premier of Ukrainian descent as of the early 1990s, so it's embraced. We have Folk Fest, where we celebrate multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. We still, though, have the challenge of integrating people of color, and that minority population is increasing in Saskatchewan, but that's still a challenge. But as I said, the bigger challenge is the Aboriginal population. And it's a festering problem, and as I said, a lot of people would rather ignore it than talk about it.
How does it work with French? Do they speak French in the schools? Do they have
yes,
French?
there are bilingual schools or French schools. In fact, there's a significant French population. There are 2 streams of, three streams of French. There's the Métis population, and there are a large number of French-speaking Métis settlements. There was a group that came from Quebec in the early 20th century, so they're in the southeast, and particularly in the southwest. And then there were people that came from France and settled in the early 20th century as well.
Do the native population, they don't live on reservations in the same way that they tend to do here, do they?
There are reserves in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has lots of reserves, but what's happening, I would suggest that today maybe only a third actually live on reserves. A lot have chosen to live off reserve. They've left reserves because of the lack of opportunity. And actually to visit the reserves today, you're like visiting a developing world in many of them. There's extreme poverty. So they live off reserve. In fact, the same thing happened to people in rural Saskatchewan. One of the big things that Tommy Douglas, the father of Medicare, did, he liked to say his greatest achievement was bring electricity to rural Saskatchewan. In fact, there were 2 Saskatchewans up until the 1950s, one with electricity and one without. Douglas brought electricity, he paved the roads, he tried to bring modern services to rural Saskatchewan, hoping to stem the tide of rural population. Guess what? If you're a kid living in rural Saskatchewan, you turned on that radio or turned on that TV and saw another life, you left. And that's what happened, and that's what's happening on reserves. Oh, yes. And John read this in the book. You know what the #1 graduation present for women in rural Saskatchewan in the 1970s was? Graduation from high school. What was the #1 present? What do you think you give? Luggage. Luggage. And I've got a, and in fact, I asked a number of women that I know besides Marley, what did you get when you graduated? They not only can tell you what they got, the make, the color, and they still have it. It's still sentimental, but that's what they got. The expectation they wouldn't stay, luggage.
I'm just curious about the Russians who came there.
The Doukhobors?
I don't know the word Doukhobor. What is
Spirit wrestler.
Spirit wrestler.
They were a pacifist group. They came here on the understanding that they would be able to settle the land communally, be able to practice their religious beliefs, and not have to swear allegiance to the crown or perform military service.
And what were their religious beliefs? What were their religious beliefs? I mean, were they a particular religion, or?
They believed that God resides in us all, and that was the founding basis to the religion, and they lived communally, and they shared, and they worked cooperatively. So they had those wonderful communal villages in rural Saskatchewan. There were over 100 of them. But the problem was that there's this backlash against, first of all, they're different. They dress differently. They worship differently. By God, they use garlic too, eh? Can you imagine how bad that was? And there's also a pressure in the early 20th century for homesteads. There was a fear that they're running out of homestead land in the early 20th century, and they looked at these Doukhobors holding this land communally. So the Minister of the Interior took over in 1905. His name was Frank Oliver. He insisted that homestead regulations be observed. So they had to swear allegiance to the Crown, which they refused to do. So many of them left Saskatchewan. They went to the interior of British Columbia. And there were about 2,000 or 3,000 that remained behind in Saskatchewan that did take out their land individually. And they are part of the Saskatchewan ethnic makeup today, which there'd be a lot of Doukhobor names. And
just one last question about them. What years did they come over?
Starting in the late 1890s, early 1900s, they came over to Saskatchewan.
Do you think they were victims of pogroms? Because that's when the Jewish population came over.
Yes, they wanted to escape Russia, and they came to Saskatchewan, as many people did, for a promise of better life for them, if not for themselves, for their children.
Do you think they were hidden Jews? Because that is when the mass immigration came to the United States. No?
No, okay. But there was Jewish settlement in the southeastern part of the province.
Bill had a picture of a Jewish family. One of the families
yeah.
in the show was a Jewish family.
Yes.
The father and the daughters in the field?
Son-in-law, father, daughter, and mother, I think. No, they weren't. They were.
Oh, sorry. It's all right. I meant it. But anyway. There are Jewish settlements in southeastern Saskatchewan, but in the early 20th century, the Minister of Interior, Clifford Sifton, didn't want them. He believed that Jews could not farm, which is a great myth. We had a graduate student do a wonderful thesis on Jewish agriculture. There. They didn't want African American or black immigrants coming. They didn't want Italians. They had a whole pecking order of who they didn't want. But if you travel to southeastern Saskatchewan today, a lot of those early Jewish villages are gone in terms of, they're very small today, but what's remarkable are the cemeteries. To come across these cemeteries in rural southeastern Saskatchewan. And there is a woman in Weyburn, I gave a talk in Weyburn about 5 years ago, which is in southeastern Saskatchewan, a genealogist. She has documented every rural cemetery. And what you don't realize is that homesteaders, when they arrive in the area, might have lost 1 or 2 children or the mother, and they're buried on the homestead. And she's got all that documented, so it's a wonderful resource if you're interested in tracing your family roots in that area.
What are some Jewish Saskatchewan writers that
I always think of the most famous Saskatchewan Jews as being the Bronfman.
Yeah, the Bronfman family, but she's... They're from Manitoba. Weisboard? Manitoba.
I know there's some from the west.
Yeah.
Is that where Canadian whiskey comes from?
That would be. Oh, that wheat.
Yes, the Bronfman dynasty, yes.
A quick question. About the Aboriginal population. 2 questions. One, are some of the reserves, do they straddle the border? with the United States?
No.
No, okay.
No, and in fact, if you look at a map of the reserves of Saskatchewan, they go from the southeast corner towards the northwest in the agriculture area. There are none in the south, or very few in the southwest. I think there are 3. One of them are Sioux, who are refugees from the Battle of Little Bighorn. But they didn't want reserves in the southwest part of the province because they believed that that was the best agricultural land, and they didn't want them reserves in those areas. So if you look at, they're in an arc.
Okay.
But there are none that straddle the border in Saskatchewan.
And second question about the Métis.
Yes.
They're not on reserves, are they?
No.
Right. And how do they get along? Are they members of that Federation of Indian Tribes?
No, they have their own organization. In fact, John B. Tatousis, who helped form this, which became the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, did not want to work with the Métis. He felt there were Aboriginal or First Nations people were different because they had treaty rights. Treaty was the essence or the key to that organization. And even to this day, I've had First Nations students that do not want to work with Métis students, particularly on political matters. The Métis actually had a choice. They could integrate into communities, or they could live in the margins of those communities. They were known as the road allowance people.
Right.
Half-breed by Maria Campbell is perhaps the best account of that.
My friend Pamela Singh works on them. Do you know Pamela?
I've heard the name.
The University of Alberta.
Yeah.
She works on their literature.
One more. What kind of intercourse is there with the northern states of the U.S. south of the border?
There is significant discussions today. In fact, Canada, John and Macdonald, our first prime minister, wanted to create an east-west nation, okay, and tie it together with the railway, et cetera, et cetera. What's happened today is that those east-west bounds have been broken and they now go north-south. And in fact, I would suggest to you that someone like Premier Wall, my own premier, has more in common with governors from the United States and the nearby states than he does with premiers in eastern Canada. They look north-south. I would suggest to you that Wall probably goes as often to Chicago as he does to Toronto for trade deals and giving talks. So it's quite noticeable today. I like to give other questions.
I was going to make a comment about how much more successful the 3 Canadian provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, have been measured in terms of commercial success and prosperity of their citizens than say, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana.
Yes.
Because every Canadian province is larger in population than any of those 3.
That's right. And the irony today is that Saskatchewan is a have province, where Ontario is a have-not province. Ontario is having a tough time these days. The deindustrialization of Ontario is happening. I always like to give away a book at one of my talks, and you're all disappearing.
They have to go to work.
So I always give a book to the, I always ask for the oldest Canadian nickel. But how about the oldest American quarter? Oldest American quarter. And I need the quarter because I need to do my, I need quarters to do my laundry. No, the oldest American quarter. This is a book on internment camps in Canada's national parks. We used internment labor to help build Western Canada's national parks in the early 20th century. So you've been to Western Canada's national parks and enjoyed facilities. Many of them might have been built by internment labor. So nobody wants a book, eh? You need a quarter. 96? I'm serious. $91, this is an auction. I've got a 91. Nobody else? Going twice? I want to see it, sir. 85 here. I'll take 85. Should I bite it and see if it's real? What's your name? Dan? Thank you very much, Dan, for coming out. Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.